Welcome everyone today to our Ask NPSMA presentation series. And today's topic is rethinking industry engagement as a team sport. And before we get into that, and for me to introduce our guest speaker, I would like to give just a few other notes here. Okay. Oops, sorry. So today, we are the NPSMA. This is the National Professional STEM Masters Association. We are a national organization that helps to promote and advance professional science master's programs through resources, connections, and opportunities. And a lot of this came from the need. So in the early 1990s, the term professional science masters was coined out of a call and need from industry, saying we need scientists that are more not just technically prepared, but prepared to have the conversations at the business level, communication, managerial discussions, and for them to actually step into their roles. And so through those conversations, the NPSMA organization was formed and helped to formalize the model that we now call a PSM. It is primarily based in this idea of a STEM plus curricula, which embeds, again, not just those technical skills, but through additional transferable business and durable skills. Since then, we have continued to be the guiding organization on this model and have grown nationally we have grown nationally to have organizations and PSM programs from across the country, over 300 different affiliated PSM programs. In all, our PSMs do consist generally of 5 key elements. Of course, there's STEM curricula, professional competencies, an industry advisory board, transferable business durable skills, and of course, an applied experiential learning component. And so while being a PSM in model is really effective and is part of our mission, being part of the organization also has added benefits. It helps to create national recognition, credibility for your program, as well as help for recruitment, visibility, and access to resources that sometimes are not always accessible at your individual institution. Some of these benefits include best practices around financing, programming, marketing, even administration of how to administer or admin your own program, course development and teaching. So we provide resources through our designed Canvas course for our members that support and supply articles, different types of coursework, syllabi, presentations, and just credentials on how to level up your own program. We also provide professional evaluation and improvement through our affiliation and reaffiliation process. So you will get national evaluators from within our community to look and to give feedback to your own program. There is a cost savings as being a member, including annual discounts to our annual conference, as well as if your institution has multiple PSMs, you can do a cost share membership. And then finally, being part of our program, part of this organization provides you opportunities to have professional development for yourself and for your network. Through webinars like today, we also have leadership roles within our organization, our annual conference. We are connected and work with our national advisory board. We have a national network. And again, as I mentioned before, we do have and can provide PSM consultations. So our annual conference is coming up, so I need to make a plug for it. Registration is open. If you have been thinking about it, now is the time to go ahead and register. Also, please make sure to reserve your room so that you can get your block discounted rate within the next 2 weeks. It is November 5th through the 8th in Raleigh, North Carolina. We are very excited about this. We have a full and packed lineup of panels and speakers and presentations and workshops, all designed to help spark ideas, collaboration, and community across this organization. And then for those who are like me and want to plan a year out in advance, save the date for next year, November 4th through 8th. We're hosting in my hometown, Salt Lake City, Utah. And then just one more plug, again, for professional development as part of this organization. We have many committees that any NPSMA member can join, including the list that you see here. And connect with us. Connect with us. We have all of our webinars and presentation series are on our YouTube channel, as well as we are highly active on our LinkedIn. So please connect with us and follow us there. So to our main event today. Today, our NPSMA presentation series, we have Francine Gens with us, and her title of her talk is Rethinking Industry Engagement as a Team Sport. And I am not on a dual screen, so I'm going to stop sharing so I can properly introduce Francie and read her bio. So pardon me on that. Okay. Today we are joined by Francie Gens, and she is the co-founder and CEO of the Institute for Networked Communities and a leading expert in regional workforce and economic development. Over the last 13 years, she has collaborated with practitioners in more than 50 regions and advised state leaders across a dozen states. Francie specializes in mobilizing the private sector to strengthen education and training systems and improve regional competitiveness. She developed the nationally recognized Next Generation Sector Partnership Model, a widely replicated approach to building industry-driven partnerships. Francie holds a bachelor's degree from McGill University and a master's of public policy from UC Berkeley. And currently she lives in Asheville, North Carolina with her husband and 2 sons. So with that, thank you, Francie, for being here, and I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. It's always kind of fun to hear somebody read your bio and feel like, is that me that she's talking about? And it's nice that we're an intimate group here. I hope we can really keep this conversational. But Megan, thank you so much for teeing that up. And this is a topic that maybe became clear in my bio. It's very dear to my heart, this question of, how do we get the private sector to engage differently in education, workforce development, and more broadly in the work of ensuring that people can access jobs that are growing, that are good jobs, and that are jobs that are important to innovation. For my own benefit, I'd appreciate if you all might be willing to introduce yourselves in the chat, just your name and your where you're joining from. I would also love, just for the sake of kicking off the discussion, if you'd be willing to share in the chat a number one challenge or a source of frustration for you as it relates to industry engagement. I'd love to just get a little bit of a temperature check on when you think about the parts of your job that relate to engaging with the private sector, what's frustrating or what's a persistent challenge. What I plan to talk through that I would welcome your thoughts and reflections on is the experience that I've seen in a lot of places. Megan mentioned I've worked all over the country, based here in Asheville, North Carolina, but have worked in very, very rural regions, very urban, in many, many different industries, ranging from manufacturing to life sciences to healthcare, technology, AI. And there's a set of kind of common challenges that I've seen come up again and again as it relates to trying to get the private sector to engage. And I think that what has motivated me in this work, my background being in workforce development and economic development, is knowing how much of that work just really cannot be addressed absent true long-term authentic engagement from the private sector. You just can't do it if you don't have businesses really at the table. And yet, even though there's lots of well-intentioned efforts to try to get the private sector to step up, it's often the weak link. So thanks, Megan, for weighing in, having industry skin in the game, and Tim, how to start the approach, how to get faculty involved. Would love to talk a little bit more about that. So keep them coming. I'm going to share my slides and just give you a little bit of context and grounding in where I come from. And then I really would love to open it up for some discussion. All right, so I'm going to start very high level and very big picture here. But bear with me. The reason for starting here is because I think before we get into the tactics around how to build a different kind of partnerships with industry, I think it's important to understand sort of the root of the challenge. And it starts here with the goal at the most general level. If you think about the goal of educators, of workforce developers, of economic developers, we want more good jobs for local people in our communities. I think that's pretty non-controversial. One would hope that we could agree that's what we're all aiming for. But the challenge is we often separate these two goals into two very different arenas. And I would argue this is kind of an artificial distinction, that on the one hand, the work of growing good jobs is the domain of economic development, right? You've got city, county, state economic development organizations, you've got chambers of commerce, industry associations, and their role is to encourage innovation, growth, and good jobs in industries that matter. And then in this right-hand circle, preparing people for good jobs, of course, this is education, higher education, it's workforce boards, it's community colleges, it's the many, many different organizations that deliver workforce training of various sorts. There's a lot of different actors there, but tends to be sort of a different world from the realm of growing good jobs. And everybody in the institutions and organizations pictured here probably shares the same goal that I started with. We want more local people and good jobs. But it's one of those things where when it's kind of everybody's job, it's often difficult to sort of pinpoint who really owns this work, right? And the underlying problem here is that you've got all these different actors that are all trying to row in the same direction. But it's hard to work together. It's hard to collaborate. Nobody's in charge. Everybody's busy across all those very different organizations. There's no sort of common point of accountability across all those different actors to say, here's who needs to be fulfilling what role. No mechanisms, rarely, to sort of create feedback loops or mechanisms to determine, who's playing the right role. And everybody's got different incentives, right? Different funding and missions, performance metrics. And grants, of course, grants will come along and incentivize, sometimes temporarily, collaboration across maybe two or more of those entities. But that's often somewhat narrowly based. Maybe it'll create a new kind of partnership between a university and a community college, for example. But it's hard to get that to really stick. And here's the real point, which I'm going to spend the remainder of the time talking about. All of those organizations that I just talked about on the previous slide, they're all being asked to build more, stronger, better, deeper partnerships with industry. This is the rallying cry, right? And we have to ask ourselves at what risk? What happens when there's all those different entities out there within a given region, all trying to build more, better, stronger partnerships with industry? And you can imagine, right? I mean, and sometimes I've asked this question, when initially working with a region, if we just list out all the tables where the private sector is being asked to convene around workforce, education, or talent, you can usually come up with a very, very long list. If you think about all the programmatic advisory boards, the CEO roundtables, the focus groups, there's a ton of energy and effort being expended to convene employers. But what happens is perhaps the most obvious consequence is business leaders get really burned out. Employer fatigue. I don't know if you all have experienced this. I know I have in talking with a business leader about the possibility of engaging around a new initiative or a new strategy. And the first reaction I get is, I cannot go to any more meetings. I'm tapped out. That's real. It's also real, though, that there's a bunch of businesses, it's often small or medium-sized businesses, that are just missed. They're just left out altogether. They may not have, a public affairs department or even an HR team to be able to participate in the many, many tables at which they're being invited to convene. So if that's the case, right, you've got sort of the usual suspects of companies that sit on every board and sit on every commission, and then a whole bunch that are missed altogether. It means that there's no real critical mass of employers to be able to inform and shape the kinds of education and training programs designed to prepare people for that industry, right? I mean, and again, I want to make really clear here that there's an enormous amount of effort put into being able to understand industry needs. But because that effort is happening in a fragmented way, right, across so many different organizations and institutions, it's really difficult to be confident that we have an accurate real-time understanding of the needs of industry. And so we have to ask ourselves, do we have integrity in how we're developing programs to meet industry needs, absent that mechanism to really understand and glean from a critical mass of companies within the targeted industry? And that leads to the question, can we be sure that students are getting the right education at the right time? And from a student perspective, I think there's sort of an assumption, an implicit assumption that somebody's done their due diligence. Somebody's sort of figured out that this program, this pathway is going to lead to jobs and careers. And I think that it's important and worth asking, can we be fully confident in the integrity in that pathway if we haven't had a mechanism to really get employers to engage at the level and depth required? There's also just this coordination problem, right? If you think from the systems perspective, you've got a whole bunch of different actors ramping up certain kinds of training programs, and a risk that everybody is building the same types of programs and oversaturating the labor market, which can contribute to wage depression and students not getting jobs, or a persistent undersupply, right? Persistent gaps or disconnects in the labor market that go unfilled, and we know companies will leave if for too long they're unable to get their workforce needs met. So the ultimate consequence here, and then I promise I'll stop with the depressing piece of this puzzle, is that businesses again and again say we can't find people, and people say we can't access jobs that are the jobs that are going to put me on a pathway to economic mobility. This is nobody's fault. It's not that we have not been trying. It's to me a challenge that fundamentally boils down to the question of, are we doing this work in a fragmented manner, or are we doing it in a coordinated manner? So I want to just pause here for just a moment. I'm going to stop sharing just for a second. Does this resonate with anybody? This description of the cascade of consequences and what happens when outreach is fragmented? Seeing some nods. Okay, great. And I'm also checking the chat. Okay. So let me then switch gears a little bit to say that if that's our frame of the challenge and why it's so hard to get employers to step up, the question that has really motivated me through my whole career has been, how do we actually get businesses to be partners in this work and not just sort of arm's length transactional customers, if you will? And to me, it's hard to get a bunch of different independent actors to work together. But the reason why it's so essential and why I haven't really seen any other way is that the only way to get industry to step up in a way that is longer in duration and deeper in commitment is by getting organized across all those different actors that I mentioned earlier that are already reaching out to business, already trying to survey them and engage their partnership. In other words, I'll say it this way. I think more than half the battle in getting industry to commit is getting organized among the many different actors that are trying to build partnerships with industry. So this model that I'm going to introduce really is built on that premise. And I'll share that this came from the learning nationally when sector partnerships for a while were a very heavily invested in initiative. All the big philanthropies were putting a ton of money into sector partnerships as a means of addressing workforce needs of a targeted sector. And when the money dried up, when as happens, right, every couple of years the grant money flows and then it kind of dries up. We had a really interesting learning opportunity as a field because we could see which of the partnerships that stuck around beyond the grant funding and which are the ones that died. And we learned a lot from the partnerships that had staying power, even without dedicated grant funding, around what it actually takes to be able to get business leaders to stick. So this model, the next generation sector partnership model, it's about a dozen or so years old now. That grew out of really a marriage of the best of what had worked from the sector partnerships, which were really a workforce thing in the workforce world, and in the economic development world, cluster partnerships or cluster strategies, which have been around for a long time, really based on the idea that if you can get an industry cluster organized in a way that helps to realize the synergies among diverse groups of firms, you see more innovation, you see more growth. So here are some of the common elements of this model, and it's worked in a lot of different places, in a lot of different industries. Doesn't make it easy, but we have really gotten to the heart of what are the replicable elements. And the most important piece is that these partnerships center on a table of business leaders. And this might sound sort of obvious, but I want to be quite specific in describing how this is different. Most of the time when we talk about partnerships with industry, oftentimes what we're talking about is literally a table where you've got university partners, you've got faculty, you've got administrators, you've got maybe other educational institutions, workforce organizations, and you have maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 companies at the table. But what often happens is that the voices of those companies tend to be a lot less loud than the voices of the well-intentioned and eager educators whose full-time job is thinking about this work, whereas often the companies are there and are often in sort of the body language is that they're kind of leaning back. Have you guys ever had this experience at a meeting where you've got your business partners there, you need them, you want them, and yet they're just sort of checked out? I certainly have had that experience many times. This partnership model insists on the private sector stepping up to play a much more integral leadership role as opposed to hanging back on the sidelines. So the table centers on a group of CEOs, and it's important that it's C-suite level leadership from companies within the same targeted industry sector within a labor market region. So we're not talking statewide, we're not talking multi-state, this is at the scale of the labor market. So manufacturing, life sciences, healthcare, very common industries that would merit a formal organized sector partnership, energy, for example. So picture you've got a table of business leaders, but surrounding that table, and I mean this literally, you've got a coordinated team of partners that represent the whole continuum of organizations that have a role to play in supporting that industry. So everything from K-12, career tech ed, to universities, to chambers of commerce, to industry associations. And they are literally seated around the perimeter of the room. And initially, their role is really just to listen. And that's actually really important because it's essential that the business leaders involved in these partnerships understand that this is their thing, that they've got to own and drive the strategy and the work in order to avoid getting back into that dynamic where the business leaders are the passive ones, and it's the education and workforce economic development folks who are driving the agenda. So the intention in the design of these partnerships in this process is to insist that business leaders really do step up to play a different and more strategic role. So think about this as sort of a mechanism, a platform from which the business leaders can define, here are the priorities that we jointly agree are essential to our industry, but that we have to tackle together. And to give you some examples, I've worked with partnerships that have been all in around particular occupational gaps for which there are no training programs in the region. For example, worked with a partnership in Connecticut where there was a recognition of there were no Masters of Social Work programs. This was a healthcare partnership in the region. And it was affecting everybody, that that this was a major gap and impeding the sector overall. And so the partnership became the place. That's not going to be the kind of priority that a single institution is going to take on, a single healthcare institution. But the partnership provided the mechanism to be able to really put some collective muscle behind that priority. I've seen partnerships tackle all sorts of issues that are broader in nature, things like supply chain coordination, permitting issues, K-12 awareness and outreach, work-based learning, scaling apprenticeship models. It's really a forum for business leaders who understand that the success of their individual company is connected to the success of the sector and connected to the success of the community at large, and who understand there's some work to be done, right? Like there's some significant lifts that no one company could do on their own. But this becomes a forum at which you've got business leaders poised to be able to drive action forward. But then you've got this bench, you've got this team of partners ready and willing to pitch in. So as opposed to it being kind of the traditional, we're asking business leaders to engage around our agenda, our programs, our grants, our initiatives. This flips the script and says, we've got to create one single go-to table at which the business leaders collectively coalesce around their own agenda that we plug into. So that's what's so hard about this, but it's also what's so powerful about it, is that by creating the shared table, you're able to get a level of depth and quality of private sector engagement that's just not possible if you're doing it on your own. It also creates a mechanism for all of those partners around the outer ring to be able to coordinate with one another more effectively. So I'm going to breeze through this just to make sure I'm clear on what it is we're talking about, and then I'd love to hear some reactions and questions. These things are built quite differently from traditional employer engagement mechanisms or efforts. I'm not going to go through every one of these, but the fundamental distinction is that as opposed to it being a forum to enlist help from employers around a particular agenda, instead it's a mechanism to get employers themselves to define the work they want to do collectively, so that the various partners within the region can plug in into something that already has momentum and buy-in from employers. So a lot of these, industry councils or focus groups or sector training initiatives, advisory boards, these are all important and worthy efforts, but they serve much more narrow purposes than the kinds of partnerships that I'm describing. I'm going to talk through this and then pause. The operating principles here that are sort of the DNA that make these things work or not work. I always find it helpful to talk about when they fail, so we learn a lot from that. It's this idea of an industry pull versus a program push. So program push is when we're in sales mode, right? Like we're trying to convince employers of the value of participating in various programs or initiatives, as opposed to allowing industry to define what they need and pulling what they need from various education partners. And what that results in is just a different kind of commitment. I mean, I always think about it like, I don't pay attention to car commercials until I'm shopping for a car. It's like it just doesn't sink in. So we're sort of using a similar premise here. We're asking business leaders to self-define their own priorities and needs in a way that makes them more responsive and receptive to the various programs and initiatives that partners offer. And it's a shared table. So this is the notion of a team sport. This is not about an individual institution or system owning the partnership. It becomes a mechanism for coordination across those many different actors. And that's what allows for more integration, right? For solutions that span institutions or span silos within an institution. So let me pause here, and I'd love some reactions and to hear what of this resonates from your own experience. And I know you all are in different contexts and environments. And what resonates, what might make you nervous, what has you skeptical. I'd love to hear from a few of you. Yeah, Tim.
Okay, who calls this group together? Looking around at the people that are on this call right now, I'm not sure any of us has the pull to get together business leaders at the C-level suite and
Mhm.
then get in, community organizations, K-12, et cetera, and so forth. So who has the power to get a group like this together?
That is a great question. That's a great question, Tim. And I think that one of the most important sort of rules of this work is knowing thyself, knowing what convening power you do and do not have, but also know thy ecosystem. Know who has the juice, and know who you might need to work through. So, on the slide that I shared earlier, that the graphic of the table, there's this little yellow triangle here called convener. The convening organization is different in every region. There's no formula. Like I can't just tell you who to go to. But generally speaking, the organization best suited to convene these partnerships is an organization that has credibility and trust with the private sector, credibility and trust with everybody on the outer ring, and is seen as neutral, is willing to convene on behalf of the broader team, as opposed to, sometimes we can get sharp elbows, and it can sort of be, and if it's a chamber, this becomes a chamber initiative, or if it's an industry association, it becomes an industry association thing. A convener in this model, it doesn't mean you're running the show. It doesn't mean it's your party alone. It means that you are providing the backbone support on behalf of the broader region. So, what I want to say though, when you said who convenes the group, or who is able to call the group together, the convener plays a really important role, but it's very important that, in order to set the tone that this is truly a business-driven effort, we refer to a certain kind of business leader that plays a really important role in the beginning as an industry champion. It's important that you have 2 or 3 business leaders who kind of get this bigger picture, who see that we got to have a different way of working. We've got to be able to come together more holistically. And it's important that those are the leaders who literally extend the invitation to the first meeting. So the convener might manage the invite list and getting the emails out, but you've got a handful of champions engaged at the beginning who can help set the right tone. I think what I'd love to talk through, and then I'd love to hear from Sarah and Megan, is, it's important to know whether your role is most appropriately that yellow triangle or one of the orange circles. And if you're an orange circle, but you recognize that you need a table like this and it doesn't already exist, I think the question is, how can you understand the landscape of existing employer engagement efforts in the region? And are there ways for you to be able to influence or nudge those industry engagement efforts such that you're getting to a qualitatively different kind of engagement, working through the organizations whose bread and butter, is convening CEOs. So not something that's easy to do, but in the spirit of this being a team sport, any player on the team, I think, has potential to help kind of plant the seeds of what could be, and encourage leadership in a different direction. And we could talk through some more examples if that would be helpful. Sarah, you want to weigh in?
Well, if you is this more for discussion, like idea generating? Is that okay? Because
Sure, of
if so,
course.
then I'd like to just get a clarifying question asked to find out where you're at right now. And are you just beginning trying to engage, or are you personally trying to find out how do you make your way in? Is it more institutional? Like, where are you at? Because I have a few thoughts, but it sort of depends on where you're at right now.
Can you say more about that? You're asking me personal,
No, for the question that was asked about how
for
do we
Tim's
get,
question. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm wondering where he's
Yeah.
at personally
Yeah.
with his program.
So, I I don't know that I'm I'm necessarily anywhere. I'm thinking about it more generally, as opposed to having a specific program that I'm trying to do this with. We are certainly wanting to engage more with industry, and trying to find the best industry partners. So I guess it would be beginning stages, maybe.
Okay. So I maybe can just share a few things that it's happening within my department. I've got a couple different programs that work with industry, and some are more mature in the relationships than others. But one thing that we have found is if you can find just one person to begin with that has a pretty deep Rolodex, that is willing to make some calls on your behalf, that's a great starting point. So we launched a project-based program that runs 25 projects a semester, and we need industry partners to be connecting with those teams. And so the way that program got kicked off successfully was a person who had been very skilled in a long career in industry came in and got it all kind of rolling and mentored the junior faculty who were coming in on how to make those connections. Because I don't know that all faculty are very well trained on how do we really build that industry partner and how do we make the ask for them to come in and participate. So that's been one thing that was really successful within our own university. A second is that we've kind of gone to a little bit more of program advisory boards. And as a PSM, you have an advisory board that's been established at least at the time your program was created, and depending on how well that's maintained and strengthened, sometimes those advisory folks have also connections. I think Chamber of Commerce was mentioned. We're fortunate in our community. We've got a strong Chamber of Commerce and an organization that's called Greater Mankato Growth that tries to stay really connected across business and industry. So the more that we can get out and be visible, whether it's one faculty or another, just sometimes showing up and building those relationships can be helpful. Also, if your university has a development person, people that work in development, that's their lifeline, is finding other people, right? So they're finding people who have the ability to give. And generally speaking, the people who can give have matured in their careers to the point where they're maybe in higher level positions or positions of influence, because that's when they have the stronger ability to also give. So that might be another place to tackle within your own university. And sometimes administrative to administrative, there's some opportunities. So those are just some ideas that I might have to throw out there as places for starting points of kind of digging in and finding out how do you kind of work your way in. So for what it's worth, I hope that that's maybe some helpful ideas.
Yeah, Sarah, and I'll just offer then, Megan, I want to hear from you that I think that kind of sort of logic that I just heard you talking through of who's already got the relationships and being conscious and mindful of where the asks are already happening, I think is sort of the pith of what I'm trying to convey, is that sometimes I think we can approach industry engagement as if it's happening in a vacuum and not fully having the appreciation of the many, many different entities that are out there already, building partnerships or making asks. So to the extent that we can be attuned to what those dynamics are, what those existing networks are, and leveraging and working through those as opposed to recreating, I think is the key. But Megan, go ahead.
I think this will pair very nicely with this conversation right now. So I was going to ask, or wanting to hear your thoughts on the model that you presented, and then advisory board. So all of our programs, we likely have one form or another an advisory board. So that's like the closest parallel I could think of between your model and what we probably currently know best. And without recreating and doing big changes, which could be very resource and high risk, how might we fit actually an advisory board into this model? Like, what are some tips or first beginning steps to help to better improve the industry engagement using stuff that we already kind of have, down? Any thoughts on that? Or how do we flip that script, as you said in the beginning, using existing styles that we already kind of know?
Yeah, well, and advisory boards are tricky, right? Because it's a requirement to maintain programmatic advisory boards, and you got to convene, industry to be able to speak to specific programs. And I think there's sort of two levels. I have in instances in places that have really adopted this model of sector partnership building. I've seen them actually replace advisory board meetings with a full sector partnership meeting once a year. Serves as essentially the regional advisory body, where all of the education programs come together with a really good group, high quality turnout from industry. So that's sort of the ideal scenario, where you've got the sector partnership table that's more broad based. You still have your programmatic advisory board once a year, but the second time a year, it's sort of plugging into this bigger infrastructure. If that bigger infrastructure doesn't exist though, and to Tim's question, you're not the right one to convene it, it doesn't exist already. I think there's a couple things to be mindful of. One is just being really aware of where the companies that you're tapping are already connecting in some ways to conversations around workforce, economic development, and education. And just that awareness, just being really sensitive to, where and how are they already tapped in, I think is super important. Secondly, just getting super practical here. It's really important in the design of the agendas for any conversation with employers that you insist on them doing more of the talking. So this is really basic, but I've seen so many advisory boards where, in the spirit of we want to make good use of everybody's time, it's super programmed that it's PowerPoint and you go through it, and mostly the industry people are just kind of going, yeah, sounds great, and kind of deferring, right? They're not necessarily leaning in at the level that you would want them to. So I think just from a design facilitation perspective, going out of your way to really create the space for the business leaders to talk amongst themselves. And I think that's the other thing I'll say, and then Tim, I'd love to hear from you, is I think sometimes we assume that companies know what they need, they just need to tell us. And we sort of underestimate how important it is for companies to have an opportunity to talk amongst themselves, and to be able to really collectively sort of make sense of their common needs or common challenges. That doesn't happen as often as you might think. And I think it's often the reason why it's really hard to get going. Because business leaders just haven't had much deep time to really think about what their needs are collectively. So thinking about advisory meetings more as opportunities for facilitated conversations among business leaders, as opposed to, we're showing you our program, what do you think of it? I think trying to sort of resist the sales pitch mode as much as possible. Because I think that it can sort of reinforce that dynamic where they're going to show up in a transactional way if you're sort of implicitly sending a message that you're in control, you're just asking them for input. If that's all they're going to give you is input. If you're looking for something deeper, true partnership, long-term commitment, there's got to be more space for them to really wrestle with and take ownership over their shared challenges. And I think that's the thing that we miss quite a bit. I will say though, it's hard to do that as an educational institution like that. That's why, generally speaking, it's business membership organizations or organizations that are more business facing that have the credibility with businesses to prompt that kind of thinking. So again, it's why I think it's so important to pair up, to team up with other organizations within your region so that you've got a little bit more leverage, a little more convening power. Tim, you want to weigh in?
Yeah. So when I look at who's around the table, both the table and outside of it, it's a pretty intimidating group for me to try to sort of interact with or be part of. And so could you walk us maybe through an example of a sector partnership that has, sort of grown this way or started this way and was successful?
Absolutely. Yeah, let me share this slide and just see if any of these pique your interest. So this is just sort of a smattering of examples of partnerships at very different stages in the process, very different places, very different industries. Would anybody like to pick one that I can tell the story of? Or I can, but I think it's more fun if you do.
Tim, since this was your question, why don't you have
Okay,
the honor?
I'm going to pick the Northern Colorado Health Sector Partnership since I think we get a decent number of people here who are sort of health sector oriented to some extent.
Okay, great. Do we have anybody from Northern Colorado?
No,
Okay.
but I'm going to be in Fort Collins on Friday, so that's the other reason why I'm
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, this one goes way back. So Colorado was actually the state that really most formally initially embraced this model of sector partnerships. They came up with the term next gen because they were one of the states that have been funding this kind of work for a long time. I'm going to stop sharing. And then money dried up, but they still wanted to keep these partnerships going. And so they said, we need a next generation of partnerships that don't depend on dedicated funding. And so the state in Colorado played a really important role in bringing the regions together. And so they assembled these teams from the region. Northern Colorado, Larimer and Weld counties, north of Denver. And Larimer and Weld counties, you might not know it if you just visit there, but man, those two counties did not play well together. I mean, it was like interstate runs between, it was like the Berlin Wall between those two counties. Like they don't work together. You know, 5 different economic development organizations, 2 community colleges, 2 universities, and yet one labor market, right? Like this is one economy. People move all the time within that region. And so in Northern Colorado, this was one of the teams that the state brought together for this big summit. They all gathered in Denver and sat at a big table, and you had your economic development people and your university people and your community college people, workforce people, all sitting around a table. And they literally did the take stock of let's list out all the places where we're convening employers to talk about workforce. And I mean, it was a super long list. Like, it's like, oh, you know, there's like 15 tables, right? And it became very obvious from that conversation that, of course, we're going to burn out our employer partners. Of course, we're asking, you know, Banner, and we're asking the health systems to go to how many meetings? You know, like, of course, this is not optimal. This is not efficient. And I like to tell this story because I remember this very vividly, that there was a moment at the table. You know, we're sitting around the table. We've just looked at this long list. Here's all the places we're convening employers. And for them, it was manufacturing and healthcare were the top 2 sectors that rose to the top. And there was a moment where it was not clear that the team really wanted to do anything differently. and a moment where, you know, we could have just said, well, we can just call it a day. We can just continue to do business as usual, or we've got all these different tables where we're convening. And it was one economic development guy who kind of leaned forward and was like, we got to try something different. Like this ain't working. And so they agreed to give it a shot. And they agreed to start with manufacturing and healthcare as the 2 partnerships out of the gate that launched. And there were some fits and starts, and initially it was a little bit bumpy, but they're now, gosh, I want to say 10 years old, maybe even more than that, maybe 11 years old. NocoMFG.com is the NoCo Manufacturing Partnership. NoCo Health Sector Partnership is the website for the healthcare partnership. Both of them have been at this for quite some time. And have gone through many iterations and evolutions in convening organization and who the industry champions are. The NoCo Health Sector Partnership has done a lot of interesting work, some of which has been around, you know, bread and butter workforce development. You know, they tell a story about early on identifying some medical assistant training programs that were a year long, which, you know, just doesn't make any sense for the wages of a medical assistant. They were able to really you know, trim those programs down. They were able to develop some new programs in behavioral health. They also did some really interesting work around regulatory changes that related to discharge from the emergency room to long-term care. So it was one of those issues that sort of impacts healthcare overall, but it's at the intersection between the big health systems and the other players. They talk about the healthcare sector partnership as being this pre-competitive table. It's a place where health care providers that are otherwise super competitive are able to come together to solve problems that really matter to the industry overall, and be able to really move the needle in a way that benefits the industry collectively. So Tim, to your question about that, the intimidating aspect of all those partners around the table, what's happened in Northern Colorado over time is there's started to develop more sort of a team identity. This is the team of public partners that jointly wraps around healthcare, wraps around manufacturing, wraps around construction, technology, the other sectors that they've really organized around. And so there's I will call it a cultural change that has taken root over the years, where yes, public partners, they've got their program, they've got their goals, they've got their institutional priorities, but they recognize that they're part of a broader system, that they can't just be kind of going it alone, going rogue all the time, that they're operating in this broader context. And I think that's the key that these partnerships enable, is sort of a recognition that we're doing this jointly. So for the manufacturing partnership, when they went deep on sort of critical skill gaps, and for example, they did a lot of work on their engineering pathways, and they discovered from feedback from manufacturers that the community college was actually doing a lot better job at the hands-on training than the university. Because that conversation came up in the context of the sector partnership with both the community colleges in the room and the university, that opened the door to create a 2+2 pathway where the university and the college are now collaborating in new ways. Like that wouldn't have happened. That wouldn't have happened at an advisory board meeting, right? Where employers are just being asked to weigh in on, what do you think of this program? It only happened in the context of this bigger conversation around, how is the system overall, how is the region overall delivering on talent, and how might we be better synced and coordinated as a region? Is that helpful? And any more questions or examples would be useful? I do want to, I hope I haven't made any of this sound easy, because it is, it's a challenge to be able to get out of the mindset of pitching programs, I'll call it sales mode, and into the mindset of, we're trying to build partnerships here. And I think, just to be very blunt about it, like the thing that I think we don't talk about as openly and honestly as we need to, is that too often when we are just out there hustling and scrambling to try to build partnerships with employers, we're kind of letting them off the hook. We're making their jobs too easy, right? I think that this is what I've seen in a lot of places where, for the right reasons, we're trying to build partnerships with industry. But because it's so hard to build those partnerships, there's almost like an over-functioning that happens where we sort of do all the work. And I think what my experience with these sector partnerships, having seen them in a lot of places all over the country, is that business leaders want to be part of the development of the solution. They don't want to just be brought in right at the back end. And I think that it sort of does a disservice both to the companies involved and to, broader outcomes for students and, those we serve, if we don't create the space for business leaders to do a little more work. We don't want to make their job too easy. And I think that's counterintuitive. I get that a lot. The question of like, well, we can't ask them for too much. They're so busy. We don't want to ask them for too much. And I think my response to that is, make it worth their time. Make the role and the engagement substantive enough such that they want to invest the time, because the challenges and the problems they're facing are real. We need them to be engaging more from a strategic partner perspective and less from a I'm just here to sort of do a favor to an educational institution that wants to know what I think, right? It's a very different way of showing up. Yeah, Leona.
Thank you. This has been very relatable and lots of great advice. To the point you were just making, it's all in the details, and I'm just thinking through what makes substantive involvement of industry partners. Like, what does that meeting look like? And I was wondering if you could get, what is the meeting agenda? What are those discussion questions that you're giving partners that let them run the meeting and be more in control?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to put a link in the chat to our toolkit, which has a ton of super granular stuff. Some of this may not be a fit because this really is specific to you are launching a sector partnership using this model. And so some of it's a little bit perhaps more detailed than you would want. But I will link to the detailed facilitation guide for the launch meeting itself. And maybe just offer in the 2-3 minutes that we've got left a couple of tips. Number one is, as I said earlier, lots of airtime for the business leaders, which means educators need to be instructed to not talk. I know that sounds harsh, but but it is real. In the setup of the room, I differentiate between the seats at the table for industry and the seats around the perimeter for educators. And with all respect and love and appreciation to our partners, try to convey ahead of time that we really need to keep the onus on industry. And to that end, we are gonna hold back. And there'll be time to debrief and there'll be time to converse. But that's super important, because what happens when you just have a combined group, when a business leader, because again, they're wrestling with this stuff, right? Like they're wrapping their minds around it. And they start to sort of say, I'm really having an issue in finding people with hands-on skills. And when an educator jumps in and says, let me tell you about how fantastic our programs are in terms of hands-on skills, one of two things happens to that business leader. Either they go, oh, I guess I'm an idiot. I didn't know they're already doing hands-on skills. I guess I'm going to stop talking because clearly I don't know what I'm talking about. Or they say, yeah, I know that person thinks they have hands-on skills, but I still have the problem and I don't feel like I'm being heard here. And so I'm going to stop talking. And either way, that's when you get the body language like this and the kind of checking out. So that's just number one, give them tons of airtime. Number two, don't ask for problems without also asking for commitments. So if you end the meeting with just like, great, thank you so much, I've now learned about all the things you want us to do. It's a setup. There's got to be some expectation that we're trying to identify the actions that we can take collaboratively. And there has to be, the question has to be called, do you care enough about this? Is this important enough for you to dedicate some further time and attention? In the context of a sector partnership, it means joining an action team and being willing to be part of a few follow-up conversations. But that's super important, that I've seen so many of these meetings that are awesome. And then at the end, it's like, well, thank you for your time, and everybody leaves. In the facilitation guide that I just linked to, we actually ask people to like literally stick their name up next to the ideas that they talked about. So you're sending the message that this is about doing, it's not just about talking, which I think is super important. I could go on and on. I know we're at the top of the hour though, but check out the toolkit. There's a ton of stuff in there that I hope is helpful.
Well, thank you so much, Francie, for this conversation. And thank you to everyone who chimed in with the discussion points too. I feel like we've just like started and just like chipped away at the tip of the iceberg here. And I know that we could keep going on. I really appreciate the toolkit and the link. And yeah, I want to continue this conversation. If I might be reaching out with a couple other comments and questions, but everyone, thank you for giving your time today and joining our Ask NPSMA seminar series or presentation series. We will not be having one next month, as it is leading right up to our conference. And so we are deferring all of our presentations to our conference. And then for those who will not be able to make it to the conference, just know that as NPSMA members, we will upload resources from our conference as well post-conference. So don't feel like you can't enjoy any of the things that we learned as well. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.